Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 5, Section 3, What is Good Now? Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan On. Hello, Pat. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, hey.
Hello.
My first question, what is modernity or what is modernism?
Wow, kicking it off easy, huh, Jason? I would say, it's the state of contemporariness. So it's everything that goes into your current milieu, right? Everything happening around you, everything that is a part of your life in this moment. It's not what you lived 10 years ago, and it's not really the future, but it's what is now. And you talk in the beginning of this chapter about you actually have a quote from Harari. So modernity is a deal. Humans agree to give up meaning in exchange for power. So I think maybe that's where you're leading us, but I'll leave off there.
Some individuals have defined modernity as the systemization or the Newtonian worldview, where humans and our natural environment are a process or a system that can be engineered, that can be understood, that can be optimized, or can be measured in its efficiency and its outputs. How does that play into the idea of exchanging meaning for power?
So humans are really the only animal that seeks to, I think, on a macro scale, optimize everything about our lives. So whether that's ourselves individually or about the environment around us. And usually in the process of that optimization, we have to sacrifice something. So there's a cost, right, to change anything in the world around us. No other animal does this. Every other animal belongs to, some group, tribe, et cetera, right, pack. And within that pack, except for maybe non-social animals, which I think there's very few of in nature, within that pack or group, there's rules, understood by everyone within the group. And humans, I think, are really the only animal that has moved away from this group dictated rules and started to see how we can change the world around us, I think, by separating ourselves from this, clan or tribal existence. Ryan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to expound a little bit on Harari's ideas, just in general, both presented in Sapiens and Homo Deus, right? Like his whole thing is around how humans are set aside from other animals because we can cooperate at scale and communicate with one another. And part of the way that we do that is by telling stories and communicating through stories at scale, and how you could never convince a monkey to give you his banana in exchange for going to monkey heaven, but how we can do that by some shared set of beliefs. And we've moved from centuries or even thousands of years where those shared set of beliefs were in the divine. And with the modern, more secular world that we live in today, those narratives need to be replaced. And they've been largely replaced with the shared sense and shared belief in growth, and how that is the trade-off that we've made. When you're optimizing for growth, and that's what everyone believes in, it spins a really powerful flywheel, but we've lost quite a bit along the way, including the way in which we engage with cultural capital, and how people can relate to it with the different shared belief systems.
What is my natural environment? I sit here in an apartment, a tiny box in the sky. I'm in a high floor of a building in Manhattan. Next to me is my Japanese tetsubin, my electric kettle. This morning I ate baba ganoush imported from Greece with Himalayan pink salt and crackers made in Sweden. What is my natural environment?
Some would argue that humans don't have a natural environment, and that's what makes us such a powerful and formative species. And we're the most adaptable species that's ever existed. That we can thrive in environments from the Alps to the Amazon. So we have further, at least in the developed world, adapted our environment to suit our needs versus the other way around.
Right. I would definitely agree with that. That you have an artificially optimized environment for yourself. Certainly, I think humans still do have a natural environment. I think the only thing that might be left to call a natural environment would be your own, I would say, inner environment, right? So within yourself, your mind, right? Uh, that's probably the only thing that's untouched by the world around you. And actually, even then, at the end of this chapter, you make an argument that even our own preferences, thoughts, etc., are influenced from society around us. So I think I would actually cut that off and just say, as Ryan said, humans are adaptable. We make our own environment.
With all of the thought leadership, incepting of ideas, shaping of social norms and desires, can we really say that our personal inner life is a pristine natural environment? Is it not a polluted environment? Um, where do our thoughts and desires come from?
I think it definitely can be polluted, as you said. But I think with training, effort, right, with some gong fu, if you're very, very diligent about your own life, your own thoughts, your own, let's say, self cultivation, right, I think you can, to some extent, free yourself from some of that pollution. But it's always going to be around you as you walk through, let's say, your outer life, right? As you go to work, as you interact with other people, as you interact with society in any way, shape, or form, even if it's just, clicking on the Instagram tab and, messaging some friends or posting some pictures online. The pollution is always there. I think it's just to what degree do you allow it to infiltrate your inner environment? Certainly, our thoughts are shaped to some degree by everything around us.
Is globalization a net force for good for Chinese tea ceremony?
Yes. So for someone who is a member of contemporary modernity, where I believe in growth, I think that it is a very good thing. Where in the past it was restricted and obscured to a regional practice, which didn't touch very many people's lives, and the people that it did touch, were very elite, and it was relatively difficult to build up all of the types of capital needed to learn it. And now, someone from anywhere can start to learn the foundations and build up that to participate in the art.
Jason, if you were to play devil's advocate, how would you debate that?
Has tea become higher quality over time? Have our wares increased in quality? Do we not still seek out older teas and antique wares? Where has the growth of Chinese tea ceremony beyond the expansion of the practitioner base led to higher quality products within the culture? Today, we desire the things that were desired by masters of the past, not by the things that were created today.
So I would say, is that really, the outcome of globalization, or is that just that the practitioner base potentially of the past century hasn't moved to a point where they're trying to shape the praxis? They're just living in the historical practice, trying to do their best to meet what they have read about how the practice was performed in the past, but not trying to shape the future of the praxis.
You also have to ask yourself, who is it serving? What do those things do for people, and who does it serve? And if people don't care about it now, does that matter? Or if only a small number of people care about it now, right? They'll keep it alive. Maybe they'll progress it. But it is a living art, and dispensing with artifact or ritual is par for the course.
I'm receptive to both arguments, but specifically the question was to play devil's advocate on whether or not globalization was a force for good. And my take on the ideals of globalization are actually that it has reduced quality of the majority of products used to perform the praxis. It's plausible that additional practitioners are good, but growth in culture could have outpaced growth out of culture without globalization. So I do not. I'm receptive to both arguments, but specifically the attempt to increase production of teas and wares has not been successful in maintaining or improving the overall quality of the teas and wares being produced.
Right. Globalization definitely leads to commodification. So I think, we've seen how, particularly I would say, the 80s and 90s, you're just having, mass factory made, crappy porcelain cups, right, that are just flooding the market to this date. And, we can think of even just in our own practice when we started brewing Chinese tea, how many really terrible, crappy wares that made tea taste so bad and even made water taste bad. We came across because that's what was available in the market. That's what's flooding the market. And certainly now, anyone really could have access to materials to brew Chinese tea. A gaiwan and some cups is quite accessible, but very few people have access to the top echelon of wares. And certainly, as you, I think, are pointing out, Jason, that top echelon of wares is still the wares from the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, maybe, just early pre-ROC. A lot of what's coming out today, certainly we do have some amazing wares coming out, but I don't think anyone's pushed the envelope to a point where people are really seeking modern wares over antiques.
I think there's an interesting question to be asked around that idea. If you consider the majority of these super high-end wares were imperial wares, fewer of them were imperial wares that were smuggled out by eunuchs from the Forbidden City and sold at the North Gate in the illegal market, and some of them were commissioned pieces by mandarins and literati that had an interest in tea. If globalization was overall a force for good versus a force for commoditization within the praxis, then we would have seen the tools, technologies, and techniques of the Forbidden City, of the imperial kilns, spread to other regions of China to create higher, more available wares across the practitioner base. Even if the cost remained high, the overall availability could have been improved. Instead, what we saw was commodification, reduction in the qualities, subsequent reductions in prices, but the wealthy, the literati, continue to seek out higher quality imperial wares. I don't think that has much changed today.
Well, I think you actually go on to write, right, in this chapter, that high capital groups keep their ideals, their preferences, et cetera, from the public eye. The wares and specifically the technology coming out of the imperial kilns, I think is not something that would have ever been shared because the people who are, controlling that information, controlling that technology, don't want the everyday man to have access to those kind of wares. So even if we did see a movement towards globalization of maybe some of that technology, I don't think it would have been broadly or widely shared beyond the borders of, let's say, Ming or Qing Dynasty China. I think returning back to your question of was globalization a force for net good? I think we also kind of have glazed over points like let's say the Opium Wars. Or colonization of India for to some degree propagation of tea. So certainly there's some other historical points too which have impacted, potentially killed millions that moved on, maybe not the practice of tea ceremony, right, but have to do with tea's history. So I think there's an interesting point to make there as well.
Along similar lines to what you were talking about earlier, Pat and Jason, I recently listened to a pretty good interview by one of the co-founders of Patreon. And he made a very interesting point around the shift of how arts were and creative endeavors were historically funded. And it was largely a patron model, right? And then we've really swung the other way into a market-based economy and market-based model. So when we reference back to some of the incredible wares produced during the Ming and Qing dynasty, right, that was entirely a patron model, which the entire world across multiple arts, multiple disciplines have swung the other direction in, right? So it's not only a problem in Gong Fu, it's a problem with globalization in general, and the way that creative people get compensated or incentivized to create new things.
Right. I would say look back at all the tea masters that we often look up to, or even I would say talk about, right, in this podcast, particularly if we're looking at Japan, right? Almost all of the high ranked or highly talked about tea practitioners like Sen no Rikyu or Takenojo, and the students that they go on to teach from there, almost all of them were patrons of some shoguns or high status warlords, particularly when we think of Sen no Rikyu, right? He served under Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So you have people who are giving not just economic but cultural capital and social capital to these arts, helping them to spread and helping to sustain the people who are really pushing the knowledge forward. So it definitely changes the way an art progresses or praxis progresses.
In many ways, you have to think about what, it could have been much worse for Chinese tea ceremony. Just imagine if Mao didn't like tea. It might not.
The Great Leap Forward would have been a little different, huh? Might have just completely lost tea instead of losing a lot of tea.
Thank goodness Mao loved tea.
In a related topic, branching off of this original conversation, what is high culture and what is low culture?
Well, we're getting to a place in time where I think the line between the two is getting a little blurred. But I would say traditionally, high culture is the arts and artifacts that the haves versus the have-nots appreciate, propagate, share, teach their children to appreciate through education, and use as a means to distinguish themselves from other social classes. So particularly, as I mentioned, the have-nots. And so low capital or low cultural capital, I would say, is usually the interest in, well, to put it very briefly, lowbrow arts activities. So I think, in the past, I think maybe thinking about it through just music, although art might be a better substitute to talk about, but thinking about it through just music, I think, rock might have been seen as a low cultural capital activity. I think to some degree, maybe in the 80s and 90s, hip hop and gangster rap was also seen that way. Although I think we've swung very far to the other way, where now you have a lot of people with high cultural capital, elevating the status of some of those music platforms as well as appropriating it. But I think that's my brief spiel on high versus low. Ryan, do you have anything to add on that?
No, not necessarily. I think that there's a lot of underappreciation in sort of lower brow culture. And just to give a fun culinary example, Jason recommended, I was doing some work in Jacksonville, Florida, and Jason recommended a restaurant called Southern Charm, which is endearingly they call themselves white cracker low country cooking, and there's no menu, you just sort of get served, and there were like 3 different fried things. There were fried green tomatoes, fried shrimp, and fried fish. And each one had a very distinct batter. It was like, there was like very little similarity between all of these. And the thought and care that went in to probably everything from the cook time to the moisture content to, the context, whether or not it was the green tomato or the shrimp or the fish, was so thoughtful, and it was so good. So like there's quite a bit of sophistication there that I think sometimes gets glazed over. And really, it's just a matter of who has the economic capital. But it does not mean that one is necessarily more sophisticated than the other.
I think to just give the quick one versus another, Mozart versus Little Yachty, a BBC documentary versus The Bachelor or the Jersey Shore. So there's our quick examples.
Just really a matter of circumstance. The creativity and agency and artistic expression is just being expressed in different environments. But
well, would you say it's the circumstance or the people who decide to appreciate it? The people with the preferences.
Oh, that's a great point. You're right. Yeah, I agree with that.
And that perfectly leads me to my next question. How do class distinctions of high and low culture serve to separate the social classes, both in general and within our praxis?
Well, people generally like to construct peer groups that are people in their image and like themselves. So it's much easier to be around people that have similar sets of experiences and shared preferences than a more diverse group of people where you have to take into account many different types of consideration in that type of social interaction. That's the more cold, anthropological look at that.
Yeah, I would say that the groups are also self-reinforcing, right, or self-regulating. So you have these people, as Ryan mentioned, who feel more comfortable around each other because they have shared circumstances. And so then they will start to create norms for that group. And if someone is breaking away from the norm, often they will be, chastised, looked down upon, etc. Maybe not necessarily kicked out of the group, but they won't be a true part of the inner group. So, these groups exist because people want to feel comfortable around each other. And then they continue to exist because there are rules that regulate these groups.
A great example, like from a movie or a Broadway show, is like Pretty Woman, right? Someone who makes that sort of transformation from up the socioeconomic ladder and it has to learn those formalities. And I think modern day culture hails people who go, can be transformed upwards, but then also reconnect back down with their roots.
It's funny that you went with Pretty Women. I think it shows a little bit of our differences, Ryan, because I went right to Mean Girls. But certainly, society likes to praise those who can climb the ladder. I think society also has a twisted fascination with those who fall from it. But certainly, no matter what the lens is, society as a whole is always strongly focused on these differences between high and low class.
Isn't Pretty Woman based on an even older story of a British woman being brought up into a higher social class?
Yes.
Is it not the Taming of the Shrew or something like that? It's not Shakespeare? I don't think I've seen Pretty Women in like a decade.
I've actually seen both Broadway plays, but I forget the name of the one that it's based off of. It's the one who has to take all the speech lessons.
Oh, the Audrey Hepburn movie? I'm trying to remember the name of that one's not coming to me either. My Fair Lady.
My Fair Lady.
Oi! I don't know if you've watched that recently. I watched it like just this past year. All right. Well, I think we successfully diverted from the topic there. What were we talking about?
What forces in today, what forces serve today in Western society to make preferences so convergent?
Class distinction is much less prevalent, at least in the States, than it's ever been before. Arguably, you could say the same thing about Chinese culture as well, at least in mainland China. Class distinctions are eroded greatly compared to the, Ming and Qing dynasty.
Right. Not to say that they don't exist, but certainly it's a little harder to see. You have to notice that oh, this person's got a Gucci belt and a Rolex, and so maybe they have a little bit more money than me. Versus in the past, where you could see, well, oh, that person lives in a castle, so it was quite obvious in the past. But interestingly enough, things that signal high class or high culture, have, I would say, in the past 2 or 3 decades, started to be really preferred by what was traditionally the lower class. And so some of these static signals were really starting to be sought out, by the lower socioeconomic classes. And you actually have an interesting reversal, I would say, in the past 10, 15 years, especially with some of the tech culturizing of people with quite a lot of capital not being interested in a lot of the items that signal social status. So you kind of have a mixing where now, as I mentioned before, a Rolex and a Gucci belt, maybe that did mean something at some point, but now, just because you have those, you might also have $100,000 in credit card debt. Doesn't really mean you have economic capital.
So, Pat, you don't have season tickets to the opera?
No, and just to signal my socioeconomic class, I've never been to an opera.
And is that because you are of low cultural capital, or is it because you grew up in a milieu that did not appreciate opera?
This is actually a good line to go down, and nice and personal. But I would say, I grew up in like northeastern Pennsylvania, not so far away from New York that I couldn't go to an opera if I didn't want to. My family was definitely more interested in Broadway, so I did go to some plays as a child. But I think opera as an art was not interesting to anyone in my family, including extended family. So there was no one around me who could really show me why opera was interesting. Additionally, growing up in the 90s, I don't think opera was very big at that point anyway. It really wasn't until we were hanging out with Mr. and Mrs. Koike. They were talking about how they attend, not just the opera, but they attend many operas throughout the world. That I started to think, that maybe this is an interesting, art form or form of expression that I should learn a little bit more about. And I did actually attend a few opera in Japan, which was interesting because, still from the Italian operettos and everything, still in Italian with Japanese subtitles. So that was fun to figure out. Saw The Barber of Seville in Japanese. But I think maybe to succinctly answer your question, a little bit of both. I wasn't born certainly in a high socioeconomic capital family, but I also was growing up in a region where that was not an art form that was considered interesting or signaled cultural capital.
In the book, I write about liberalism and cultural omnivorousness. What do those terms mean in the context of our culture?
I'll just take a shot at it. I think, liberalism in this sense is meaning being open to or having an open mind for different experiences, cultures, ideas, thoughts, etc. And omnivorousness would be being interested or showing high cultural capital through having a broad, although maybe not particularly deep knowledge of many cultures, many arts, many objects of interest. So being able to speak to a wide breadth of knowledge versus particularly having a deep knowledge in one facet.
And is that because our present culture lacks a feeling of high faceting? Is it because our culture doesn't have enough of a history to draw on? Or what is it about Western culture that now drives people to be omnivorous, to learn about other cultures?
I would say it's the quest for authenticity. We have this almost very voracious quest towards authenticity, and usually that's the first question people ask when say trying a new restaurant or new place to get food. Is it an authentic Indian grocery store? Is it an authentic Sichuan restaurant? Mostly because they don't know how else to ask that question. But I think that's you know that's where we see a lot of the appetite, is increasing the number of experiences that we have that are interesting. And there's this whole thing between physical objects and experiences. And at least within the case of New York, like it's fun. It's fun as a millennial living in New York. I'd love going to try like a new Georgian restaurant or something like that. It's an experience, and I want the authentic Georgian experience, of course.
I think we'll follow down the line of authenticity, but I just wanted to mention real briefly that I think society as a whole now is more interested in generalists as well. Think of the last time, and obviously with COVID, you're going to have to think back real far. But the last time you were at like a party, a social gathering with a lot of people you didn't know, maybe this isn't true for either of you, but sometimes you start talking to someone who has a very particular interest and they know a ton about it. And depending on what that topic is, it can be quite interesting. But I think society as a whole kind of starts to look at those people and go, wow, like what a nerd. Like this person knows way too much about this, and that's not cool, right? It's something that I think society has kind of steered away from. Sometimes, knowing too much about something isn't really rewarded in our social milieu. So I think that's part of the omnivorousness discussion as well, being that you can talk about a wide swath of topics, and maybe the people around you will be interested in one of those, and you can continue the discussion on that. But if you just know a lot about, let's say for us, Chinese tea ceremony, how many times has that been a really good party starter, and you just break the ice with, well, I practice Chinese tea ceremony, and how often does that discussion go on for 30 minutes versus if you're talking about, let's say, postmodernist art, or let's even just say hip hop, you're going to find someone to talk to about that or basketball for hours. So I think there's something to do with, our current social environment and just discussion as well.
I don't know. Every time I say I prefer alternative social justice jazz rap, the conversation just seems to trail off.
So you get what I'm saying?
RTJ.
See, but if you say it that way, then everyone knows what you're talking about, and then that's a good party conversation right there. I think do you think Killer Mike is ever going to hit you up for a collab on this chapter?
I hope so. He took Bernie to one of my favorite fried chicken restaurants in Atlanta, and I'm gunning for the same experience.
All right. Well, RTJ5 featuring T Technique.
Collab. RTJ, RTD, T.
Well, I can't mix business and pleasure, but maybe we'll get back onto the authenticity train, because Ryan looks like he's thinking about how much he's going to have to edit here.
Ryan, have you ever looked for the most authentic pad thai in New York?
No, not actively sought it out, but I have identified my favorite pad thai.
Is there such thing as authentic pad thai?
There is actually. Pad thai is strangely authentic. Really rich national history. It's fairly recent, but it is strangely a very national Thai dish. It's not like General Tso's chicken or sesame chicken is to Chinese food.
Do things need to have history to be authentic?
I would say it depends on the frame of reference, right? So like is like chop suey, it's authentic to what it is. It has over 100 years of history, right? So is it authentic to Chinese food? Well, that's probably too vague of a question. Is it authentic to Cantonese food? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly authentic to Cantonese restaurants in America.
I was going to ask the question the other way, actually, is pad thai was developed as a nationalizing dish, a dish that was supposed to be adopted across Thailand in the 1930s during the unification um, and part of the nationalist movement. So, yes, there's a history there, but is it something that arose naturally from the incubating culture, or was it something that was engineered and promoted? Does that make it authentic, or does that make it inauthentic?
I think it's very top down. It also depends on frame of references, right? Like if you look at like the culinary history of Russia, right? One of the bigger trends in post-Soviet countries like Russia and Poland are the concept of these canteens, Soviet-era canteens that serve, you know, what generally is thought of pretty bland food like stuffed cabbage and borscht and I think it's all delicious, but like very traditional mainstream canteen food is going through a huge um, being revitalized. Now, even though that was a top-down imposed cuisine, to what degree is that? I think it's authentic to that time period.
Chicken Kiev is not chicken from Kiev.
Actually, I don't know the origins of that recipe.
I have a quote here that I'll ask a question based on. When we take a closer look at how many supposedly authentic activities, such as loft living, ecotourism, or the slow food movement, we find a disguised form of status seeking. It was by Andrew Potter, a professor of philosophy at the McGill Institute. Can you give an example of authenticity as status seeking in tea?
Lao Benjang, great example. People,
Yeah, or any yancha. So particularly, if you're, sharing something as zhengyan, right, yao cha. So saying that it's coming from, I don't know, like I think in this chapter you specifically mentioned new rocha, right? So tea coming from new langkung, or any other really origin specific authenticity claim. Thinking outside of origin, Chao Zhou Gong Fu Cha is always said as, this is the Gong Fu Cha. Everything else is just kind of, let's just say a bastardization of Chao Zhou Gong Fu Cha. So often you have people making authenticity claims that if it's not Chao Zhou Gong Fu Cha, you're just brewing tea.
What about Lao Benjang, or what about brewing Chao Zhou Gong Fu is status seeking, right? Many teas come from a region. When you say this is real Neuro Cha, this is from Lao Benjang. What about that statement, the status seeking?
no, largely the fact that it's just not that good and not worth the price, at least in the case of Lao Benjang, right? The value, if you look at the cost to value ratio, the reason that it's skewed is the fact that it acts as to signal cultural and economic capital. Really is not worth that much on its merits.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you said, but I don't think that's the reason why it's a status signal. I think, these areas, let's say for the authenticity of a tea, these areas, at some point historically, Lao Banzhang obviously is only in like the past 15 years. At some point, tastemaker said that this tea from this area is amazing and you need to try it. And so a lot of people, demand goes up. A lot of people want to try it, and eventually it becomes inaccessible and heavily faked. And because it became heavily faked, then being able to show that, I can access the real thing shows that not only do you have the economic capital to buy it because it's crazy expensive, but that you have the social capital to obtain what is supposedly the true thing. And then, of course, the cultural capital to understand and enjoy it. So it's signaling on all fronts. And no one just, consumes La Banzhang and doesn't post a picture of it on Instagram. So there you go.
On Instagram.
You mean when we had Lao Banzhang with Zhou Yu in 2012, you didn't post a picture on your blog? Was that sentence signaling? I don't know.
Did I call it out as Lao Benjang? Is that in the? It must be in the alt text.
I don't think you called it out in the blog, but there's a good example, right? Where someone shared with us a tea, so that we would have an education and a frame of reference. They're sharing with us that this is the true tea for, I would say, educational reasons versus telling us, hey, this is Laobanjiang. It's so amazing. You should buy some. So, I think the authenticity debate it becomes much more important when there's, I think, a monetary incentive or a market incentives behind it versus when it's for educational purposes.
Is authenticity always a good thing? Should practitioners always choose the more authentic tea?
I think you should choose the better tea. So it's not always necessarily the authentic product. There's always, innovations in all agricultural spheres. So you talked a lot about wine in some previous chapters, and natural wine, and how that has gone through, some renaissances and been able to create quite an interesting product, right, in that market. The same thing is true of tea. So just because the tea comes from an authentic area doesn't mean it's going to be the best version of that tea. Certainly farmers who are really passionate, who might just be, let's say, slightly outside the designated area, might make a better tea, and their land might be better for that tea. They might be better processors. It's not always the case, but I would say it's really what matters is the tea in and of itself, not the authenticity of its origin claim. Brian, you look like you have some thoughts on that.
No, just echoing what you said. I think what you said. I think that innovation is important. It needs to be supported, and without it, nothing. This doesn't become a living art. It doesn't progress forward, and it gets pushed to the realm of artifact.
My last question: how much of our preferences are our own?
Deep. So I think we addressed it a little bit in the beginning, where I think I had mentioned that if you are really cultivating yourself and you're really purposely thinking about what are your thoughts, what are your decisions, you can filter out a little bit of the noise of, let's say, media, marketing, the thoughts of the people around you, et cetera. But I don't think anyone can do that 100%. So I think for sure our society, the marketing forces around us, they all find a way to infiltrate our mind and shape a little bit of our thinking. I think it depends person to person, but I think none of us are completely free from this thought forming process, that society encultures us with. And actually you talk about it in a previous chapter, but enculturation is a part of all of our upbringing. I like where you went though at the end of the chapter. How much of our thoughts are our own. We do see that there's the objective, of course, reality that we live in, and our own lived experience. But how much of our lived experience shapes our thoughts versus the experience of our society around us. And you have a sentence right at the end of this chapter. Bordeaux asks who prefers it. I ask, who are we to know what is good now? And you asked the question at the end of the chapter, so I thought about an answer. I think that we certainly can look to the past and see what was good, and most people can agree upon what was good. The three of us are in an industry where we have to look to the future and think about what will be good. As far as what is good now, I don't think there's a way to know what is good. I think that you can have beliefs on what you think is good, and you can create what you think is good now. And the only way to actually make that, the thing that will be good now, is to try and drive a shift in whatever it is that you're doing. So for Chinese tea ceremony, if I believe that something is good, I need to, put my cultural, economic, social capital behind that and try and drive that forward within the praxis. So, maybe you don't know what is good now, but you can shape it. It doesn't mean you don't have the, agency to shape what you believe is good. So that was my thought as I read that sentence.
Really like that, Pat. I totally agree. It's the future isn't written, and the state of preference shifts is non-deterministic. And at any given time, it could take multiple paths. You just have to have the right stakeholder, the right time and the right place in front of the right people to move that forward. And it's interesting, we're all in the food and beverage and product development space. And, as a company, we frequently get asked about trends and what our take on trends within food and beverage and flavor are. And we say, well, we're actually very anti-trend. At any given time, right, you could have multiple unmet preference states, and good products create trends, not the other way around. You can create, the best vanilla ice cream, right, and it will create its own trend. But hopping on that bandwagon, or thinking that it's deterministic and that the future is written in terms of what trends are going to be in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. It just depends on the right product at the right place at the right time, or the right person at the right place at the right time to push it forward.
Now, Jason, I know that you had said that that was the last question. I do think that this chapter has a really nice thread from looking at authenticity as it is marketed down to exoticism through Orientalism. As you were writing this chapter and thinking about, the section name, "What is Good Now?" What led you to craft that narrative, going from capital, then to authenticity, through authenticity to exoticism, and then ending with Orientalism? I think it's quite relevant. So I want to know what you were thinking.
Outside of the structure of the chapter itself, a lot of this came to a pointed conclusion because our desires are so convergent. And seeing our desires reflected in the historical record in ways that are, I don't know if unacceptable is the right word, but in ways that are no longer considered to be warranted. Things like Orientalism, things like exoticism, the ideas of barbaric splendor, right? You don't go to tea gardens that are considered to be modeled after the Orient in Central Park anymore. That would be less than okay. Right? It would be a questionable thing to set up individuals with fans on pedestals and mixing Persian carpets with Chinese tea. Right? That would be considered a corruption of the authentic culture in today's society. And yet we do have desires to go sit in a more authentic Chinese tea garden, to have tea in a place that might be beautiful, but is constructed to be beautiful. And those desires are maintained and shared, even as some of the forms have changed. And the forms have changed in such a way that we believe that they need to be a reflection of the authentic experience. And the authentic experience is a marketing tool that's used by merchants and used by society to say these things are real, right? So what is real? What is plastic or made up or desirable? These are questions that are going to follow us throughout the rest of the book, because they are so prone to idealistic corruption, right? Is Jinjunmei good? Is Jinjunmei bad? Right? That's a tea that was developed in 2006. Right? I call it, I believe, in this chapter, the platinum pop album of tea. Right? There's nothing authentic or inauthentic about it. It was a tea that was developed in 2006 from a relatively famous area, and was well preferred at that time. And now it is much less common, right? Is it just like a song or an album where,
One hit wonder.
Yeah, one hit wonder? Is it a peak and a trough, right? Or what will come next from that? So the ideas that follow us through this chapter lead us to a point where we realize that our desires are reflected in things that are no longer acceptable, and you must wonder what is acceptable, what's shaping my desires into these forms, and the next the next chapter with a bunch of sections is wealth and knowledge in Chinese tea ceremony, which will step back from a pure Bordwarian analysis and will use some of these tools or some of these ideals and frameworks in order to reinterpret and re-understand the historical record, both from the development of tea and tea ceremony in China and our predominant culture, the Western omnivorousness, maybe the global omnivorousness, and individual liberalism that have reinterpreted and reshaped things that we believe to be true, that have landed us in our current situation. So, do I want to go sit in a Chinese tea garden and drink tea in the comfort of a shady area with someone playing guzheng and reading poetry by Stonehouse? Yes, absolutely, I would love to do that. Do I think that anyone should be standing over me with a fan and holding a plate of dates, and have the food set out on a Persian rug? That seems a little bit tangential to my personal desires, even though that's what it meant to do an Oriental garden, from the culture that I am ostensibly from, the Western culture.
And just for the context of those who are listening to the podcast, but maybe not reading the chapters alongside it, you're referencing The Chinese Garden by, and I might butcher the name, but Francois Boucher, a particular painting which is included in this chapter. So thanks for that answer, Jason. I think that, kind of really let me peer into your mind. And I'm just excited to, as you mentioned, this idea is going to continue throughout the book. So I'm excited to follow along this journey with you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for the discussion of the next chapter, Wealth and Knowledge in Contemporary Chinese Tea Ceremony.